just been watching a fascinating documentary by Sky News Australia. Well, it's an interview, actually. It's a very long interview with Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who is an academic who had the misfortune, perhaps the naivety, to go and do some research in Iran. She'd been invited to a conference there and she wanted to learn more about the politics of the area and tensions between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims and this kind of stuff. And she was invited by a friend to go over there, attend this academic conference, which she did. And somewhat, naively in my opinion, particularly as her husband was Israeli. Anyway, so she went there. After she'd been there a few days, staying in a hotel, the hotel owner comes up to her and says, some people have been asking about you. And she says, well, what do you mean? What do you mean, some people? And he wouldn't say, he just, clammed up, but he just said, they're very bad people. And, Kylie there is thinking, well, it's a good job I'm going home soon. So she goes to the airport the next day to fly out of Tehran back home to Australia. And then she starts putting her baggage onto the machine so it can be taken onto the aeroplane. And the airline receptionist person there sort of refuses to take her baggage and sort of lifts it back off the carousel and puts it kind of back on the floor next to her. And she's like, what's going on? And then a group of plainclothes Revolutionary Guards, most of them men, I think it was about 6, most of the men, I think one woman, came over and they said, you need to come with us. And she's like, what do you mean, what's happening? And they hand her a document written in Farsi. And at that time, she didn't speak or read Farsi. And they said, it's a warrant for your arrest. And she's like, what? But anyway, she had to go with them. They shepherded out to some sort of interrogation room actually at the airport. And I think for about 3 hours, they started asking her questions. And during this, she said, look, it's getting, this going for a long time, my flight's going to leave. I'm going to miss my plane. And because she hadn't twigged on what was happening here. And apparently they all burst out laughing when she said that. And of course, she'd end up spending, I think, 803 days in Iran rather than the original week or so that she'd intended. And I think then, of course, when they're like, you're not getting on that plane, and they all found it funny that she thought she was, then she begins to realise this could be, this is bad here. I won't go through the whole of her story, because really, she was initially treated okay, well, semi-okay, better than you'd expect. She was actually taken to a hotel that it seems was kind of used as kind of a safe house for holding witnesses or prisoners or whatever of high value, because it apparently was being used as a hotel as well as being a safe house. And so she was put in a room there and told, you can't leave your room. But it was a hotel, it was all right. But each day, a couple of people would come and they, for several hours, they'd interrogate her. At that time, they were trying to make up who she was, or work out who she was spying for, and they apparently jumped from MI6 to the CIA to Mossad to the Australian spy service, whatever they're called, and they were just like trying all of these different ones because they needed. I don't know if they actually believed she was a spy. I mean, she clearly wasn't. She was just an academic researcher. I'm sure that this is just the game they have to play. I'm sure the interrogators weren't dumb enough to think she really was a spy. But anyway, they were doing this, interrogating for long periods of time. And then they said, we've got to move you to another hotel. And she's like, yeah, I'm not being moved to a hotel anymore. And this is where they stick a bag over her head. And she gets stuffed in a little Peugeot 106, which actually is not a bad car. I used to have one. And she's driven to Evin prison, which I think is somewhere on the outskirts of Tehran. And it's a notorious one that's run by the Revolutionary Guard. It's not a normal prison. And here's where it got interesting. Well, not interesting, awful, really. She was initially, for 28 days, put in solitary confinement, which was a room that was so small that when she lay down, she's actually very tall, this lady, she couldn't lie down because her feet didn't touch, her feet would touch one end, her head would touch the other, so she couldn't lie down. And she was given 3 blankets, all of which had clearly never been washed ever, and plenty of others had used them. I won't describe how she described them, but it was pretty gross. And obviously she had to put one on the floor, one as a pillow, and then one to cover up with. And the lights were on 24/7. There was no toilet in there or anything like that. So she was allowed to go outside half an hour in the morning, half an hour in the evening, with a bag over her head. 28 days. And she said, after a while, and there was no light, there was no natural light, no window. There was a boarded up window, so she could just about keep her biological clock kind of running in terms of knowing whether it was day, night, because a little slither of light during the day came through. And she was smart enough to realise as well, when she heard the birds chirping, that was sort of the dawn chorus and this kind of thing. So she kind of knew roughly what time of day it was, and she would scratch on the wall each day. But here's where it went from being psychological torture, and I think at some point, she said, if I could have killed myself, I probably would have done. I was so low at some point, and you can imagine that. But because they weren't interrogating, it wasn't like, at this point, you're sort of wanting just to see your interrogators, just for with her, obviously a very intelligent woman, it's just the mental boredom, apart from anything. She wasn't allowed anything in there. She wasn't allowed a book or anything. So she was trying to sort of meditate herself into a state of kind of bliss, I suppose, or nirvana or somewhere, which I guess is not a bad thing to do. But yeah, because there was a point where you're hoping for your interrogators, because any company is better than no company. But anyway, so this went on for 28 days, and she's going crazy at this point. She has no idea what's going on outside, if anyone knows what's happened to her. But then they ramped up the level of psychological torture. And in a way, it shouldn't be funny, but it was. They put her still in solitary confinement, but a larger room now. And she was given a television. And you think, wow, isn't that cool? A television. But this was equivalent to Japanese water torture. So what they would do is early in the morning, the telly would be automatically switched on from outside. It was a telly that was stuck on one channel, and it was Iranian soap operas. And apparently they'd repeat the same one several times a day. And so from dawn till dusk, you'd have this television on, blaring out this Iranian soap opera, and she still didn't speak Farsi. And she said that was worse. She almost would rather have gone back to the previous cell. I mean, this one actually had a toilet in it of sorts, which I guess is a bonus. But she just described being forced to listen to Farsi soap operas all day, and apparently it was absolutely doing her head in, and that she was there for ages as well. Of course, eventually she gets her day in court, and it's a formality that she's going to be convicted because she's a high-value prisoner, and she'll be useful for an exchange of all sorts. And she finally gets, no, in fact, even before she'd got moved to a normal prison, she was still in Evin, or however you pronounce it, and she does describe her one escape attempt, which I thought was interesting. It was so, even though it's like a Revolutionary Guard sort of black site, they've been doing work in the yard, and by this point, it seems she'd been there quite 9 months, I think, by this point. So she was allowed outside to wander around with other prisoners, and she'd seen that they were doing some work on one of the walls or one of the roofs above a wall, and they'd left some bits of metalwork and stuff at the bottom, and she reckoned she could climb it. I think she must be quite athletic. She saw there were spikes at the top of the wall, so she took her socks off and put them on her hands to give herself a little bit of protection from the metal spikes, and she managed to scale up the wall and get onto the roof of a neighbouring building. And so for the first time, she was sort of able to see where she was, and she said she could see just, beyond the walls of the prison, right across, she could see like a river and stuff, and then some residential areas. And she said at that point, she actually probably could have attempted an escape if she had any help from outside, but obviously she had no money, couldn't speak Farsi, and no one on the outside to help her. So she just sat there for about 20 minutes, and eventually, apparently the guards couldn't climb up where she'd climbed up. They weren't up for that. So they had to kind of, get a ladder, climb up another building, carefully make the way across the roofs, and eventually they got there. An amazing one, your assumption of Revolutionary Guards is that they're just going to, they're not going to shoot you because you're a high-value prisoner, but the assumption is that they'll at least nab you and, give you a good beating or something for that. But apparently they didn't. They were actually calling out to her, the sort of the ward, what would you call it, sort of chief warder of the prison. I forget what they call them in English now, suddenly gone. But, the person in charge actually got up there as well, and he was calling out to her saying, what do you want? Why are you up here, at this point, they thought this is a chance. They said, I want to be able to talk to my family. I want to be able to talk to the Australian ambassador. I want to talk to a lawyer and these kinds of things. And remarkably, it did gain her a few very small concessions. She was allowed for the first time to be able to talk to her father for 2 minutes. And apparently there weren't any, consequences in terms of like physical assault or anything. I'm sure they, deprived her of what few privileges she had, if she had any, that sort of thing. The only time she actually described, and so she went back to court, sentenced to 10 years, and then she was sent just to a normal prison. And obviously she's just waiting for diplomacy to be done so she can get home. But the only time she did describe being physically attacked, she had asked to see that she'd been on quite a few hunger strikes and stuff, so I imagine she wasn't particularly healthy, and she'd asked to see the prison doctor. And she'd written a letter describing how illegal her treatment was, and how everything that had been done to her. Now it was just a kangaroo court, and the charges were fake, and she wasn't allowed a lawyer, and she wasn't even allowed a translator in court, so she didn't even know what was happening, and all this. She'd written a long letter, and what she hoped was that it could be somehow smuggled out via the doctor, because she thought, if there's anyone you can trust in this prison, it's the doctor. And so although they'd search her carefully before she went to see the doctor, she'd managed somehow, didn't say how, I won't speculate, but to secrete this letter in such a way that she got it past apparently 3 searches, and then she got to see the prison doctor. And at this point, she slipped it to the doctor. And then the doctor, calls himself a doctor. What a scumbag. Apparently, he looks at the letter, says, no, I can't help you with that. And he gives it straight to the guard. So all of her effort to get it there was wasted. And apparently it was a female guard, and she went absolutely nuts. She called another guard who was a male guard, and they both ran in and just beat her up. And she was screaming at the doctor, saying, "What? Are you a doctor? Are you just, just a beast? Are you just an interrogator? And then she was forcibly injected with a tranquilizer. To try and shut her up, because I imagine she was probably flipping out a bit at that point. But that's the only time she describes anything like that happening. So maybe our vision, at least if you're a high-value prisoner, maybe our sort of our mental image of Revolutionary Guard custody and, general, normal prisons in Iran, maybe sometimes we exaggerate, although I'm sure there's plenty of dark things that happen. But I think with her, in fact, I know with her, because she was a high-value prisoner and they wanted to do some serious negotiations, they were actually really trying to get her husband over there. They were doing their best to lure her, because her husband was Israeli but lived in Australia. They kept on asking her to lure her husband over there, with promises of freedom and everything, if he just comes and talks to us. But of course, they really wanted him, because then they got a really high-value prisoner, an Australian Israeli. And what they'd actually done, they had told the person in charge of the prison she was in that, you need to make sure she's all right, because she's a valuable prisoner. So it seemed they paid a lot more attention to her needs and health and welfare than they did with the average people in the prison. And also it seemed that they'd even, how it is on these prisons where you tend to have certain people are kind of in charge of different parts of the prison, certain prisoners that kind of boss others around. It seemed that if anyone ever tried to give her trouble, she always seemed to have some of the more, dangerous looking prisoners kind of at her back to protect her. So it seemed that she was being protected, because they were obviously intending to do some kind of settlement or prisoner exchange. But I haven't quite got to that in the video. But so don't go to Iran if you're a Western citizen, whether you're a spy or not, because you may well get nabbed. And who wants to be subjected to Farsi soap operas at a set volume or telly you can't turn off, blaring in your face for 12 hours a day? Not me.